Great.
Yes. So tonight we have Simon Han in conversation with Meng Jin. They've both written their books that we have here. Little Gods by Meng Jin from HarperCollins. Beautiful cover. And Simon Han was born in Tianjin, China, and raised in various cities in Texas. His short stories and essays have appeared in The Atlantic, the Iowa Review, Guernica Electric Literature, and the Texas Observer. A former visiting professor at the University of Tulsa, he currently lives in Carrollton, Texas. Enjoy the show, everyone.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much to Green Apple Books for hosting this, and to Simon for writing this beautiful novel. Nights When Nothing Happened is an achingly tender portrait of a first-generation Chinese American family trying to understand how to love each other and themselves in a suburb of Plano, Texas. Or maybe it's not a suburb of Plano, Texas. Plano, Texas is a suburb of Dallas, Texas. And yeah, this is a beautiful, beautiful book. I'm so excited to be here with Simon. In this book, Simon Han has so beautifully put into words so many inexplicable and ineffable aspects of the Chinese American and suburban American experience. And I saw myself in this book in so many ways that I never have before in literature, which is just to say I'm so happy that it exists and so grateful to Simon for writing it. And now, without further ado, Simon, would you read us a little bit from this book?
Yeah, thank you, Meng, for being here. It's so good to see you, and thank you to Green Apple Books for hosting. This is really exciting. So yeah, I'll read a little bit from the beginning of the book, which may give you a sense of the neighborhood that the Changs live in. And all you need to know is that the little girl of the family, Annabelle, she's sleepwalking in the middle of the night, and her brother, Jack, is following behind her. Although in this scene, he doesn't know where she is yet, so he's kind of looking for her. A car passed on Main Street, its headlights flashing through the fence and illuminating the leaves floating in the pool. His sister could be drifting toward this vacant stretch of road where high schoolers tore through in trucks with wheels bigger than her, blazing a shortcut out to Sheridan. He followed the path he imagined her taking between houses and down alleyways until he reached the sewage creek that cut through the community. During the summer, he remembered, the feet and underside of a duck had bobbed there for days. On the grass that sloped up from the creek, he spotted the glow of the other slipper. His sister stood a few yards away, on the bridge that overlooked the creek. Under a towering steel streetlight, she swayed slightly. Her head was lifted, and a white glow bloomed from her neck up to the stretch of baby fat under her chin. Her eyes were closed, as if she were basking in the pool of light. If Jack did not know better, he would have thought a spaceship had beamed her down to earth. He sidled beside her, a slipper in each hand. He was Annabelle's protector, but sometimes he did not know what to do with his hands. Hear me in there? Knock, knock. Annabelle blinked. You found me, Daddy. A few dead crickets still clung to the lamp. The stink of the summer's crickets had carried through the end of fall, and perhaps would last through a winter that never arrived. It was no wonder he thought American air to be unsafe. In those early years in Plano, Jack had held his breath around diapers and hospitals and graveyards and urinals and police stations and fertilizer and roadkill and cameras and his father.
Thank you, Simon. So I want to start off by talking about Plano, Texas. some of the passages in this book have some of the most lyrical and beautiful writing I've ever read about megamalls and cul-de-sacs. And so I was wondering if you could just tell us a little more about this place, what drew you to writing about it? And especially I appreciated the way in which you've inserted Asian Americans into, the story of the American suburb. So was this something that you thought about while you were writing? And how did Plano, the place, inform the story? And how did it evolve in your imagination as you wrote?
Yeah. Well, I grew up in Plano, Texas, and I think growing up there, I didn't think about the giant Asian American population that was there. I didn't really think that there was much of a story to tell about that population either. Partly maybe because I was sometimes just bored, but I think other times I was probably trying to fit myself into other people's stories. And this is speaking broadly, but this is, I think, something that Asian Americans just like learn to do at an early age, is to fit themselves into other people's stories and relate to other people's perspectives, rather than kind of centering themselves in their own stories. And I think that with time, leaving Plano and then looking back, I mean, it occurred to me, of course, that there was no one, like, at least that I knew of, like, writing fiction about it. And I never thought to, like, my first attempts at creative writing, like, I would write about a New York City that I've never been to. And I think it showed. But then it occurred to me that there is something weirdly strange about the city that I grew up in, that there is something that drew me, that like an image that always came back to me is like the way the sprinklers at night, in the middle of the night, would sort of have this like dance across the lawns. And I started to think about my home in a way that was both loving, but also, I began to see it a little more clearly for the ways in which it excluded other people, the ways in which it told a very singular and simplified aspirational story. The motto of Plano, Texas is the city of excellence. And so, like, what does it mean to be excellent when you live there? And what happens if you fall outside of those boundaries of excellence? And once I started thinking about all these things, it felt like there was actually a story to tell, but it took a while to get there.
Yeah, and just for those of you who are watching who don't know, I've read earlier drafts of this book. I was very lucky to have been able to peek into the writing process. And I feel like what came out through each of the drafts was the ways in which the Asian American population fit into this story. Like, that was really present in this final book in a way that it wasn't in the former draft. So what was that? Can you talk a little bit more about how it felt to insert that narrative, and like, and to, as you said earlier, like, not just insert yourself into someone else's story, but like just, bring the focus onto your own experience?
Yeah, I mean, I think that when you start centering a particular experience and centering yourself, what you're really doing is you're allowing yourself to imagine or expand the possibilities of what you can imagine. And part of that was not even centering myself per se, but like reading other Asian American literature, like reading your work. I got the chance to read earlier drafts of Little Gods. And I think, I was able to, like, I think acquire a kind of freedom in the way that we were able to represent our Asian American characters. And maybe you can, I'm curious what you think too about your process of revision and sort of finding that freedom, because I think when we start, I felt that either my Asian American characters had to be had to say something distinctly like Asian or something, like be super Asian in a way that was really more for a white audience, or to just be like morally upstanding citizens, or to be sort of morally righteous even if they're suffering. I think that there was just a limited scope of what I felt was possible, even though my own existence and with my friends and family, like I knew there was so much more that was possible. So there's like this disconnect between like my lived reality and then what I imagine could be on the page. But with time, it was just like leaning into the messiness of our identities, right? To even call these characters Asian American is itself a really messy thing with so many layers, and it's very hard to categorize the population that this specific family, the Changs, in my novel is meant to represent. And so it was freeing to just say like they don't have to represent anything or anyone. They can just be, their own messy selves.
Yeah, I love that. I want to hear more about the Chains. So while I was reading this book, I felt so strongly a sense of loneliness and alienation coming from each member of the family, not just like by virtue of them being Chinese American in this mostly white suburb, but also that they were alienated from each other. None of them is quite like the other. And I know that's like something you can say about every human, but in particular, they each of them come to America at a different time. So like none of them have like this like sense of like shared immigrant experience, right? And in particular, Jack, who unlike his parents, doesn't feel fully Chinese, unlike his sister, Annabelle, who is born in America, has these years in China in which he's actually not with his parents. He sort of tries to resolve it by seeing himself as a kind of bridge between his parents and Annabelle. But often I just felt him like so estranged and alone in his family. And I think I remember that an earlier version of this book had the word strangers in the title. Is that right? Am I remembering correctly?
It is. My much worse title did have the word strangers.
Wait, what was the title?
Oh, do I have to tell everyone?
You don't have to. You don't have to.
No, it was A History of Strangers. Yeah.
Okay.
But,
Was it like Strangers in the Night at one point? Maybe
no,
I that
no.
up. All right. Well, anyways, I basically, this is a long way of saying, could you talk a little bit more about, the idea of strangeness and strangers, how one might be a stranger to one's own family, and did you envision this family as like a group of strangers living together, and how much did you think about loneliness and alienation while you were putting together this family?
Yeah, thanks for that. I think that in the beginning, the trouble with the earlier drafts was that I was thinking about the family as this like almost like monolithic whole in which they weren't differentiated the way you're talking about. And I was thinking about a sort of classic us versus them dynamic of this Asian American family versus white society. And there, like, I know that there is definitely a story to tell about that, but I was just ultimately more interested in like the family itself. And so a movement that I wanted the novel to take is to start thinking about stuff like the threats in society out like on a macro level. This is set in the early 2000s, post 9/11 Iraq war. Like school shootings were becoming like more prevalent, and And so there are these big ticket like news things that the family, the Changs, have to sort of live under. But it became more interesting to then bring those threats inside the house, inside the family. And then I started asking questions that sort of scared me, like, okay, what happens if you're scared, or what happens if you're a little boy and you're afraid of your own father? Like it was harder to write a story that explored questions like that. But it felt like the right questions to ask, because I knew like the history behind these characters, like you talked about. They're all coming from different places and different motivations, and they are strangers. And so it was less about how does this family assimilate into larger white society, and more about like how does one assimilate into your own family, and hopefully also like questioning assimilation itself.
Yeah, I definitely felt that. How does one assimilate into one's own family? I'm going to think about that question for a long time after this call. Yeah. So you also brought up the idea of fear and threat and danger. And that's another thread that runs with like these like subtle light touches, and sometimes it explodes from the subtleness into something a little more intense through the book. The idea of safety and security, and on the flip side, danger and threat. So at one point in the book, you write that Patty and Liang moved to Plano because it's supposed to be super safe, right? Like it's modeling itself as like the safest city in America or something like that. And yet there, on the flip side of that, there's like a very different Plano being portrayed, which almost feels like it's like a land of warnings and alerts. In throughout the book, we see how both the children and the adults are living in this environment where they're sort of taught to fear. Like the kids have these safety drills at their school, like school shooter drills, and they're taught all these ways to like say stop to predators. And at the same time, the parents are getting like Amber Alerts on their phone. And of course, when we think of suburbs, we also think of neighborhood watches and that sort of thing. Everyone in this book is thinking about safety and danger, how to keep their kids safe, or the children sometimes like fantasizing about danger. So I guess I was just wondering, why is there so much messaging in this world about fear, telling them to be afraid? And do you think this is like, does this feel like an aspect of suburban life for you, or something specific to Plano? And what drew you to this theme?
Yeah, I love that question. And I'm afraid I won't be able to answer it adequately, because I think it's such a complex question. But I think that, like fear is obviously a real thing. It's a bodily reaction that is intended to sort of protect oneself. It's instinctual on some level, but there's also the fear that can be weaponized, right? That we see in our society today, and we see sort of misdirected or manipulated in a way that harms people. And I think that these warnings that you talk about, the neighborhood watches, the ways in which, in the novel, for example, the kids are told they can't say certain words. They can't say the word bomb. They can't say the word kill. Like, this is something I definitely remember hearing growing up in Plano. And I think that they don't come from a place necessarily at first of like being weaponized and directed towards a certain person. But in general, there's a question of like, who are these warnings for, right? Like, they are for the people in the in group, the people that have been accepted within the confines, the safe confines of the suburb. They're not for the quote unquote outsiders, or the people perceived to be outsiders. And so that fear then becomes connected, I think, in this case, to who in has power, right? And the chains maybe at first feel like they do, but then they get to a point where they lose that power, and then they have to sort of navigate those shifting boundaries of, okay, am I really part of this city that I moved to be safe, like, or am I the intruder now, I guess?
Right. Am I the person that people are warning?
Yeah, exactly.
Messages are warning against.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, so without giving too much away, that, that idea that you just articulated becomes a central sort of plot point in the book, where the structures that are supposed to keep people in Plano safe, the police and social services, end up becoming the opposite for the Changs. They end up, the police and social services end up becoming the real threat to them, threatening to break up their family. And as I read this, it just struck me how, this is a narrative that's been pretty vivid in the public consciousness this year, in particular, in conversations around police brutality and systemic racism. But we rarely see Asian Americans enter into this narrative. And yet, and I realized I never seen this story written out in this way before, and yet I recognized it completely, right? I was like, yeah, I thought back to, it made me think, how did I think of the police when I was a kid? How did I think of social services when I was a kid? And it was exactly the way that these characters thought of them, as people I had to behave around, because if I didn't, maybe I would get taken away from my parents. And I guess I was just wondering, how that storyline developed, and if the protest movements and the conversations that have been happening this year, how they figured into your writing, and if they influenced your writing process at all.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, well, I definitely finished a draft before, at the start of this year. So there's that. But I think that, I mean, Asian Americans in particular have a very tricky way of navigating these kinds of conversations now, right? And particularly East Asians that are upwardly mobile and sort of have the privileges of sometimes not being seen as threats, right? And by these institutions, and so but at the same time, they're not seen, and I don't think they'll ever be seen as necessarily white people either. And there's so they're sort of almost trying to navigate where they fit in these larger narratives. And so that's something that I don't think my characters were thinking about in 2003 necessarily when this novel is set, but they're sort of confronted with that. They probably, without even thinking about stuff like aligning themselves with whiteness, that they were doing that, and they were trying to be as, to fit the sort of stereotypical image of the white suburban family as much as possible, because it made them feel safer. And I think that, it's tricky, because these are characters who I think it would be sort of disingenuous to make them super aware of that kind of stuff. These are new immigrants who are just trying to get by. They don't really have the language to to think about these power structures and the ways that like constructions of race are like playing out in everyday life. And I'm really grateful that we are able to have those conversations and to see the nuances of how this stuff plays out today. But in thinking about this in fiction and thinking about this set in 2003, it was like I had to sort of approach it in a very indirect way, you know, where my characters weren't even really aware of that, and they were probably perpetuating that at times. And it's just, again, like messy. It's just messy. And I don't know that they will ever arrive at a complete understanding of that. But I didn't want them to either.
Yeah, I mean, I love that moment in the book where you reveal that they've bought the model home.
Yeah.
And like they're like, oh yeah, we have the model home. Like that must be a good thing. But it's like, wait, the model home was a lot cheaper and the realtors were dying to sell it. And like that comes out at this crucial moment where it really says something about this family and what you just said so beautifully about like how they're not aware of the ways in which they're sort of like placing themselves in the society. So I guess to transition from that, I was wondering if you could read a little bit from that scene. Thanksgiving is around the corner, and there is a wonderful Thanksgiving scene in the middle of this book where everything sort of comes to a head. I love this scene so much. I recognized it down to like the smell of the Chinese takeout that everyone brings and the lack of a turkey. And I especially loved a part in this scene where you know, all the dads, including the one white dad, are watching football. So I was wondering if you could read to us a little bit from there.
Yeah. So this is Thanksgiving 2003, and yeah, the Changs are hosting, even though they don't really want to. There's a lot going on in their lives, but they're hosting this party, and one of the girls, Annabelle is the girl in the family, and she has a friend named Elsie who's white, and her family has been invited. So that's where I'll start. Her father is watching football with the other fathers. Elsie's father, like her mother, seemed to belong to a different generation, a different time than Jack's parents. He sat with his legs crossed, a wrist balanced palm up on the knee as if an invisible cigarette was smoldering between his fingers. His hair seemed windblown by the years, thick and silvery, with no trace of Elsie's red. The sight of the man breaking out of his portrait pose and hunched over as he tried to clean up the stain, and he dropped some wine on the rug, so there's this stain, felt incongruous to his nature. He was, as Jack had overheard him saying earlier in the night, retired. You had to have accomplished things in order to be retired. What's that? Jack pointed to the man's rusted belt buckle, the faint outline of a skull and crossbones design. It seemed not so much old as valuable, or valuable because it was old, like something that could go into a museum. This, my buddy, belonged to my grandfather. Elsie's father's eyes twinkled, with excitement maybe. He was a member of the local 20 Tough Tamales. That's TUFF, by the way. Ever heard of it? There were so many things Jack had not heard of. He could watch CNN until the commercials turned to late-night infomercials, and still he could not hear it all. His father looked on, drinking his beer, as if to hide his roving eyes. No, my grandpa isn't from around here. Not many folks know about it, said Elsie's father. That's the thing about this place. No one's really from around here. As if a sudden idea had popped into his mind, he unbuckled his belt right in front of the other men. He slipped the leather out from the loops on his jeans and handed the belt to Jack. Jack blinked slowly. For me? Elsie's father laughed. For the next 5 minutes. The buckle was heavier than Jack had expected. He was not sure if it was okay to touch. As he shifted the belt between his hands, Elsie's father explained that the 20 tough tamales was from long ago, when there was a club for tough guys from Plano who practiced good deeds, a precursor to the modern fraternity. Jack did not ask him what a fraternity was, let alone a precursor to one. His father was looking at the TV, though Jack knew he didn't care about football. It occurred to him that his father didn't know what a fraternity was either. This, he had to admit, disappointed him.
Thank you. So first, I'm so curious about 20 tough tamales. Is that a real thing? I mean, there's it. It's like so subtly. It's such a subtle and light touch in this book, but like I felt so much menace in that moment, and I wondered about if there's like a historical complement to that.
It is. It's a real thing that I found while doing research in my own city. There's like this tiny museum that is located in one of like one of the old like settler houses in Plano, and it was in that museum, and it just sort of gave a history of like the old Plano, and before any like immigrants came. And one of the pictures on the wall was of this group of white dudes that were like, I think, sitting in a boat or a sailboat or something. I don't remember, but they were they were the 20 tough tamales, and they were like that sort of language I used there. Part of that was taken from there. They were like a club. They did good deeds. You know, that's what they were known for, and I just thought that was so fascinating and strange, because it was also like a really corny name to me, the 20 Tough Tamales. But they were in the picture, they were just so like gruff and like I don't know. They just there's this like idea of masculinity just oozing out of them. So yeah, I somehow had to get that in the book.
Yeah, no, I love that. And that idea of masculinity really comes through in that scene. I thought of another scene too, in which Liang has a poker night with the other Chinese dads in the neighborhood, in which he sort of like describes them as all looking a little dead. And really, I guess like that scene and the scene that you just read made me wonder about, you know, Chinese American masculinity and sort of the myths of masculinity that are inherited from Chinese culture, and like how that plays out when, you know, they're transposed into a different culture, especially with Jack's father, Liang. Yeah, in this scene with Elsie's dad, you really feel sort of like this, I feel like you really feel this like shame in Liang, even though he's not really there, because Jack is more eager to impress this white dad than his own. And throughout the book, you also mention how, like, you know, Patty, Liang's wife, is the one who's working, and Liang is the one who's like cooking and taking care of the kids, and he feels kind of emasculated. So I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about your conception of Chinese American masculinity and myths of masculinity.
Yeah, that's really interesting to think about, like the differences between masculinity coming from China and then entering into a American conception of it. And I think that I'll have to think about like those subtle differences more, but I do think that like in either country, that Liang, the father, like hasn't been able to locate himself within those stories of what it means to be a man. And you know, he is a photographer who has these very like initially noble sort of goals for his work that are, you know, it's meant to sort of create these portraits that of families that they could keep and pass down, you know, down generations. And that they could sort of use to sort of remember the people who came before them, and that, you know, that sort of thing. You know, I remember the portraits in my family that will always be, you know, in like it's just a particular picture, you know, that sort of gains kind of a permanent place in the family, because it's like a way to sort of access someone. Anyway, that's a kind of goal of his that isn't really supported in the society that he's coming from, and then he moves to America, and he does so following his wife Patty, who goes to grad school, and there's always this feeling of him needing to follow her, and to not really have a way to sort of lead his own family forward. And I think that in some ways this like comforts him, because he's never had like someone leading him in his life. Like growing up, he didn't have a mother figure for very long, and he didn't like really have a present father himself. But there's a particular, you know, weirdness to that too, being someone who's like dependent on Patty, yet also resents the fact that he's dependent on her, and that I'm sure is wrapped into his conceptions of what it means to be a man. And then in American society, he sees all the other fathers who seem to have figured it out, and he still hasn't, and he sort of retreats farther and farther into himself. And to be fair, it's not just coming from him. Like Patty is telling him to do certain things that she also thinks that, quote unquote, the man of the house should be doing. And so I think we're all sort of, this is something that like the whole family, including Jack, including Annabelle, it's like a story or a myth that everyone has some kind of relationship to. And I think it does lead to conflicts that they probably, you know, hadn't anticipated.
Yeah. It's especially striking to see like Jack as a kid processing his father trying to, you know, wrestle with his own demons. Um, I wanted to talk more about Jack. So Jack is, his mom calls him Jingle, which is means golden dog, and it's like this loving nickname that's that he proudly owns, because he's like this, like, you know, awesome son. And while I was reading Jack in particular, it struck me very specifically sort of like Chinese cultural notions of what being a good kid is, like being obedient, like 听话, as you say in the book, or like, you know, 懂事乖, like these like, this is how you are a good son, sort of feed almost directly into American model minority mythologies. So Jack is sort of like perfectly primed to like transition from being this like jingle into like this this like, you know, model of a Chinese kid in Plano, Texas. So I guess my question is like, how do Jack's various perceptions of what makes him a good son and a good brother, in turn, and like also in turn a reliable kid in the eyes of his white neighbors, influence his decision making in this book?
Yeah, I think that it's funny because I know that like I and a lot of my friends probably wished growing up that our parents would like cut us some slack, or like, you know, let us run free a little bit more. And for but you know, and they had their reasons, and I'm obviously appreciative, and I think my parents are watching this, so I'm also telling them like, no, I'm not criticizing, but but I think that Jack is like experiences something that I didn't, which was he wants his parents to almost like to sort of order him around more and like be like, hey, like you don't have everything figured out. Like we need to shape you more, because he grew up without them. He also like once he got to America, they already had Annabelle. I mean, they just had Annabelle after he got to America, and then it's like it was very hard for him to find his place in the family. And on the most basic level, he is their son, but in being their son, like should be enough, but he feels like he has to somehow earn his place. And so part of that is to, I think, be a version of what he feels like is a model son. But by being that model son, that also means that he gets less attention. And so that's just like it's like a sort of contradictory feeling where he's like put himself in this place where he's just invisible. And he doesn't quite know what to do with that.
Yeah, that's so interesting that like being the model makes you invisible. Annabelle's the opposite. She's like
Yes.
she's a little bomb. One of those forbidden words. What I loved her character so much. There's like this one line. I like they come home at one point and she like announces to the neighborhood. She's like, "Hey, shitheads, we're back." And she's like, I don't know, is she like 7 or 8 years old? I was wondering, yeah. Well, how did you think of Annabelle as a character?
Yeah, I mean, that's why I loved writing about her, because she doesn't have those pressures that Jack feels, or even that her parents feel, to kind of make themselves acceptable to society, and that in turn like make themselves small and quiet. Like she very much wants to assert her presence wherever she goes, and if anything, she wants like the world to change for her, to like the world better like follow her rules. And that can also lead to a sort of manipulation, right? And that was really fun to write, but maybe disturbing for the people in the characters in the book. But yeah, I think that I wanted to imagine a character who didn't feel like they needed to assimilate, right? Like, and that also offered like new opportunities into the story.
Yeah, I love that. And it like it becomes a problem for everyone because they expect her to be quiet
Right.
and nice. Um, so for those of you who are watching, there's a Q&A at the bottom. And I have like one more question for Simon, and then I'll turn to the Q&A. So feel free to put in your questions into the Q&A. All right, so I guess my last question is just about since we started off the conversation talking about, how, we met many years ago when these books were still just ideas in our heads. I've been like super nostalgic recently thinking about the past. I think isolation does that to you. But I was just thinking about how like when we met, we thought we were like so avant-garde and transgressive because we were like, we're not going to italicize Chinese words. Um, and how the literary landscape has changed so much since then, where like now like that's just like, whatever, nobody italicizes foreign words anymore unless they're French words or something. So I guess I'm just also wondering, like, if you could just talk a little bit about how you've grown as a writer and changed as a writer through the process of writing this book, and as like, the American literary landscape has changed.
Yeah. That's totally true. Like I remember us having that conversation, and I think that we met, Meng and I met at a writer's workshop in upstate New York, um, and yet we were the only, I believe, like one of the only Asian American writers there, and at the time, like you were one of the only Asian American writers I knew, and I think that was really like meaningful to sort of to be able to. I think that's why we were sort of we were really proudly wearing those badges of like knowing things that like or like feeling like we carried these ideas about like our art that like people didn't get, you know. But it's been incredibly also inspiring to see that like these things that we thought only we knew were actually like are now just like part of the fabric of what Asian American literature can be. And I think that shows just how much we, like writers as well as readers, have expanded like the possibilities of their imagination. And to that end, I think something that I've learned to do is to just think beyond like stories that are meant to be kind of uplifting our people, so to speak, like this idea like that we are lacking something and then we need these stories to sort of lift us up. Like I love the fact that we can write about these inspiring stories of overcoming sacrifice and all that, but I also love that we can write about we can write disturbing stories, we can write stories that really unsettle and with really unlikable characters, or that we can write about like lean into joy and into, you know, unbridled joy in moments in our writing. And so to just have that freedom is, I think, something that I've learned. But yeah, what about you?
Oh, what about me?
Yeah,
I mean, this is about you. Yeah, no, I think similarly, just like there's less pressure, right? Like I feel like when we started writing and like when we met each other, there was like so much pressure on like being a Chinese American writer, because there were fewer Chinese American books out there. You felt like you had to like cover all the cover all the territory, tick all the boxes, you know, like, oh, gotta talk about this part of the experience too. And now I think that was, you know, so one of the Rachel Marks has a question that her question is, knowing that the two of you traded drafts of your books during the process, what were ways in which one story might have influenced the other? And I think like for me, like being able to read Simon's work while I was learning how to write too was like, oh, like there's someone else doing it. Like I don't have to, you know, write about that. He's got it. Simon's got the suburbs. Like Simon's got like Tianjin. Like he's got this awesome story about how it feels to like be a kid on summer vacation in China, you know, like and I don't have to write about that. So it was freeing, really. Do you have a answer to Rachel's question?
yeah. I mean, this is a very specific example, but something I know that you helped make better in my novel was particularly the character of Patty and her relationship to her job as an engineer, and her relationship to science. And because this is something you did so beautifully in Little Gods, the way that the mother at the center of your novel, you know, it's a very fraught relationship that she has to being a physicist, but also it's very beautiful. Like there are just these stunning passages of like of her thinking about science and how that sort of like colors her, the way in which she looks at the world. And in the beginning, when I was thinking about this job that my mother had of in the novel had of like being a engineer, I was just thinking about in very simplistic terms, like this is just a job that takes her away from her family and she's just stuck doing it. But I think reading about like in sharing drafts with you, I learned that like, okay, she actually likes her job too. Like there's something that really draws her and to this job, and it's very meaningful. It's also very, it's strange for her to have these kinds of interactions, usually with a team in India. And there's just like, there's so much more you can take out of this. And maybe this just goes to a larger point about like, we growing up, like maybe have simplistic versions of how we imagine our parents and those before us, like what they did, to make it in America. We have so much more freedom that we tend maybe to give the complexity to our experience, but actually there's a lot of poetry and lyricism, perhaps even in the maths and sciences, in the ways that you brought it out in your book, were really influential for me.
Okay, well, this event is supposed to be about making Simon blush and not making me blush. So I'm gonna move on to the next question. Thank you for that, Simon. I'm so flattered. Rachel Chen says, this book seems like a suburban Gothic novel following that literary tradition. Is Annabelle named after the Edgar Allan Poe poem?
Yeah, totally. She is. Yeah. And there's even a section in the book where I basically say that. Basically, the way I imagined it is that the parents had read that poem in a textbook when they were studying English, and that's how they came across the name. But definitely, Poe was on my mind when I was writing this book, and I love that. I love the way you phrased it as suburban Gothic.
Yeah, and I think a good follow-up question to that is from Rita Bullwinkle. This book is amazing. Simon, are there other stories or novels about the suburbs that you love?
Hi, Rita. Yeah, definitely. I love Cheever. I love how just like surreal, but there's like a specific surrealism of Cheever that I really like. I like, a book that I use kind of as a structural model for this, with the alternating perspectives between father, mother, son, daughter, was Rick Moody's The Ice Storm. I thought of Celeste Ng's work, of course, Everything I Never Told You, and in the ways that sort of characters can orbit around one another but also like have these intersecting stories, but also miss one another. And I love the way that book moved through perspectives like that. And I'm sure there are more. I'm just like, there's it's I think the suburban novel or category is a very interesting one that ought to be complicated more in the future, because the suburbs in America are changing so much.
Yeah. So you inadvertently answered another question about whether there are parallels to Celeste Ng's book, which the answer is yes. And then there's another wonderful question from Albert. Simon, I grew up in Plano from 1990 to 2006. And one of the defining features of Plano and the surrounding communities that has always stuck with me was how the region was constantly changing at warp speed. Gigantic strip malls would replace fields overnight, and entire immigrant communities would show up in school at seemingly the same speed. Did that pose any challenges as an author to try to define a place that defies definition?
Yeah, I love that. I have recently moved back to Carrollton, where my parents live, so right bordering Plano. And I haven't lived here this long since I was 18. And like so much of Plano or the surrounding suburbs are like sometimes unrecognizable to me. And I think part of the challenge in the novel was to sort of capture that rapid change. I mean, it helped that the novel was a snapshot of a particular time, 2003, But even then, things felt like they were changing every year. And, asking myself, like, what that would do to the character or even memory of the city if every year there would be new waves of residents that don't really have a relationship to the city, and particularly with like the giant immigrant population in Plano. I wonder if there's something attractive to moving to a city that, it constantly reinvents itself the way that immigrants often do. So that all of that was on my mind, and thinking about also, what is lost because of all the change, like what histories are we forgetting? There's some particular dark moments in Plano's history that I didn't even know about, even though it was only like a few years out. Like in the 80s, there's this string of suicides. In the 90s, there's this string of heroin related deaths that like made national news. It was in the Rolling Stone, and Plano was called the heroin capital of the United States. And I didn't know that growing up. But these are things that maybe get lost in the change.
Yeah, I love how you wrote about the ways in which Plano changed too, and the ways in which like different groups bring in different stories to the city when they move in the book. So I think we're running out of time, so we'll just have, I'm going to combine two questions into one question. So the last question will be about how your own life story has influenced character development in the book, and also about your earlier writings and what led you to write a novel a novel. Yes, what inspired this form for telling this story? So I feel like that's, those sort of are, how did your early life and your early writing influence the form of this story?
Yeah. I mean, I think, well, the novel started as a short story, and which I think you read too, Mom. And it was only from the perspective of Jack, the boy in the family. But it became a novel when I realized that what was more interesting to me was like writing this kind of interdependent book about characters always existing in relation to one another and their environment. Like I didn't, and maybe this is, in thinking about, there's this particular Western convention too, right? Of like a novel being focused on a singular protagonist with this like a singular drive and goal at the end, and everyone in the way of this protagonist is some kind of barrier, right? And I think that when I thought about writing this sort of interdependent work, I knew I had to involve all four perspectives, because I needed to sort of see how they fit and didn't fit, and how they sort of crossed and then missed each other. And I wanted each of these characters to exist individually, but also their identities are sort of inexplicably tied to one another. So it grew into a novel as a result. And maybe this is cheating, but like that maybe is how my earlier life changed too. Like when you're a kid, you maybe think of yourself in this more independent way. And you don't think that, for example, your parents had histories before you, which seems like a very obvious thing. But that, as I guess I grew, my like desire to tell that kind of story came to fruition as well.
Awesome. I love that. Thank you, Simon. Thank you for writing this beautiful book. If you haven't bought it, you should buy it, which I think Green Apple Books is now online to encourage you to do.
Thank you, Simon. Thank you, Meng. We have signed copies of Nights When Nothing Happened. Thanks, everyone. Have a good night.
Thank you so much. Take care.